As the last bus rumbled away, the group of campers stood by the lake's edge, watching the retreating dust clouds in silence. They were a mismatched bunch, 5 teenagers from various cities who hadn't known each other until that morning. The camp, Cedar Hollow, sprawled along the edges of Lake Mirrow, surrounded by dense, dark forests, an isolated pocket of land far from any town. It promised a true wilderness experience for the teenagers who, for the next 2 weeks, would have no internet, no cell phones, and barely any contact with the outside world. The camp's director, a wiry man in his 50s with sunken eyes, had wasted no time handing out chores and cabin assignments. When asked why there were no other campers this season, he simply shrugged and muttered something about bad luck with the season and staff shortages. The 5 teensily, Nina, Brody, Kara, and Tyler glanced at each other skeptically, but none of them wanted to be the first to question it out loud. With nothing else to do, they divided themselves into 2 cabin skills in one, boys in the other, each set deeper in the woods than they would have preferred. Night fell quickly in Cedar Hollow. By the time they gathered at the central fire pit for their first evening together, the sky was an inky black, dotted with stars. Brody, a lanky, sarcastic 17-year-old, stoked the flames, creating tall orange plumes that flickered against the silhouettes of the trees. The forest around them felt strangely still, an almost eerie calm that made every crackle of the fire seem unnaturally loud. It was Illy, the quietest of the group, who spoke first. "Do any of you know why this place is so empty?" Tyler, who had already taken on the role of de facto leader, shrugged. "I heard Cedar Hollow's been around for decades. Probably just lost its popularity. I mean, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere." "But look at this place," Nina said, wrapping her arms around herself. Her usually bubbly energy had dimmed since they'd arrived. "Why would anyone come here? It feels like a horror movie set." Kara, always one to mock superstition, rolled her eyes. "Well, as long as no one here is planning to summon any demons or explore haunted caves, I think we'll be fine." But her joke didn't quite land. Even Brody, the skeptic, only gave a half-hearted chuckle. There was something in the air, an unease they couldn't shake. Over the next few days, the group settled into a routine, exploring the campgrounds and taking careful note of the various trails, some leading down to the lake, others winding up through the woods. They found a few abandoned cabins deeper in the forest, their doors hanging off hinges, windows cracked. Ellie noticed that the trees near these old cabins were stripped of leaves and covered in a strange, greyish moss, even though it was summer. On the 4th night, Nina woke the others with a terrified scream. The sound shattered the quiet of their sleep, and within seconds Tyler and Brody burst into the girls' cabin, flashlights in hand. "Nina, what happened?" Tyler asked, his face pale. "I saw someone," Nina whispered, clutching her blanket, "at the window. A face, pale, with these huge, empty eyes." Brody exhaled. "Probably just your reflection, Nina. It's creepy out here, but there's no one else around." But Nina shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No, it wasn't. I know what I saw." Though the others tried to reassure her, the encounter marked a shift. For the rest of the night, sleep remained elusive for them all. Nina's words lingered, feeding their own sense of unease. The following day, as if to shake off the gloom, Tyler suggested they take one of the longer trails up to a lookout point on a hill that overlooked Lake Mirrow. It was supposed to be a stunning view, and he hoped it might lift the mood. But the trail was stranger than they'd expected. Despite the clear day, the path felt dark, as if the sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy overhead. Shadows seemed to slink along the edges of their vision, and every once in a while, one of them would turn around, convinced they'd heard footsteps, only to find nothing behind them. When they finally reached the top, they stopped short. The lake stretched out below, but it was oddly still, a sheet of grey that seemed almost solid, like a thick layer of ice. But the most unsettling part was the mist. It clung low, curling like tendrils around the water's edge, hiding the distant shore from view. Kara frowned. "This feels wrong. Look at that mist. It's like it's alive." They were about to leave when Eli stepped forward. "Wait," he said. He looked nervous, as though he was about to reveal something he'd kept hidden. "There's something I haven't told you guys." The others turned to him, surprised by his tone. Eli had been the quietest of them, the one who barely spoke unless spoken to. My grandfather grew up near here, he continued, his voice low. He used to tell me stories about Cedar Hollow before it was a camp. It used to be a village, back in this. He said people went missing, and eventually, everyone just left. Nina shivered. So why build a camp here? Money, probably. People forget. He glanced around, as if expecting something to materialize from the woods. My grandfather said there was something wrong with the land. Said the lake was haunted. Tyler rolled his eyes. That sounds like a story to keep kids away from the water. But Eli shook his head. My grandfather never told me that to scare me. He told me because he thought the lake took people. As the days dragged on, the tension only grew. They began to hear whispers at night, faint voices on the wind that drifted through their cabins. Footsteps echoed in the woods, just beyond their sight, and strange symbols began appearing, carved into trees along the paths they walked. Kara, trying to maintain her usual bravado, insisted it was just one of them playing a prank, but deep down, even she was rattled. Then, one night, Brody disappeared. They searched everywhere calling his name, retracing paths through the darkened woods with flashlights in hand, but no matter where they looked, there was no sign of him, not even a footprint, not a single piece of clothing snagged on a branch. By morning, desperation had set in. They found the camp director, who simply stared at them with hollow, indifferent eyes. Kids get lost sometimes, he murmured, as if in a trance. They'll find their way back, or they won't. Furious and frightened, the remaining 4 retreated to the cabin, trying to decide what to do. But that night Tyler vanished as well. Panic descended on the remaining 3. They barricaded themselves in the girls' cabin, whispering frantic theories about the curse of Cedar Hollow, about the lake's appetite, about the thing in the woods with the pale eyes Nina had seen. Sleep was impossible, and every creak, every gust of wind outside, felt like a warning. As the hours passed, Eli began mumbling, almost to himself. It's like the stories. They come out when there's enough fear. The spirits that never left the village. They're drawn to the fear. He raised his head, eyes wide with terror. They're feeding off us. That's why it's happening. Nina started to weep quietly, her hands trembling. Kara held her, though her own face was drained of color. With no other choice, they decided to make a run for it at dawn. If they could reach the main road, maybe they could find help. But as they hurried through the mist-laden forest, their footsteps echoing on the damp earth, they began to feel eyes watching them. The mist thickened, obscuring their path, and the further they went, the more disoriented they became. Finally, as they stumbled into a clearing, they saw the lake stretching before them, but it was not the lake they remembered. The water had turned dark, almost black, and faces seemed to rise within it, pale, empty-eyed apparitions, silently watching them. Before any of them could scream, a hand reached out of the water, skeletal and dripping, grasping for them. And one by one, Cedar Hollow claimed its final campers. The chill of the lake's spectral grasp lingered in the silence that fell over Cedar Hollow. For days afterward, the air grew heavier, as though mourning the loss of the campers, blanketing the forest in a ghostly fog that seemed to emanate from the lake itself. Weeks passed, and despite half-hearted searches conducted by local authorities, not a single clue surfaced about the teenagers' whereabouts. The camp director left Cedar Hollow shortly after the last of the search parties dispersed. He left the buildings abandoned, their doors swinging open to the elements, the forest slowly reclaiming the camp. It was said he simply walked out one morning and never returned, though a rumor began to spread that he, too, had vanished somewhere along the forest paths. Cedar Hollow was once again left to the shadows. Yet Cedar Hollow was not forgotten. The families of the missing campers were relentless, refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. And as winter passed and spring came, a local group of paranormal investigators, the Midnight Circle, became intrigued by the camp's dark reputation. The team of 3, Eden, Marla, and Luce, was known for delving into lost places with histories no one wanted to acknowledge. They arrived one overcast evening, just as the last light of day cast its dim glow over Lake Mirrow. Eden, the unofficial leader, adjusted his camera, squinting through the mist that clung to the lake. "This place has a different energy," he muttered, watching as the fog seemed to twist and move, as if beckoning them in. Marla, the researcher of the group, flipped through her notebook. "I found articles on Cedar Hollow. Not only were there the disappearances last summer, but the camp has a history going back almost a century. There are accounts of entire families vanishing from here back in this, a few mentions in local legends. It's as if the land swallows people." Luz, the tech wizard, set up audio recording equipment along the edges of the clearing by the lake. "If there's anything here, well, catch it. This place is perfect for paranormal energy." He switched on a thermal scanner, pointing it toward the trees, but found nothing unusual at first. The three moved toward the abandoned cabins, their flashlights cutting through the mist. The buildings were shrouded in silence, but as they stepped closer, they heard a faint sound, a low hum, almost like chanting, drifting on the breeze from somewhere deep within the woods. Aiden raised his flashlight, his voice tense. "Did you guys hear that?" Marla nodded, her face paling. "That wasn't the wind." Following the sound, they ventured further into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The humming grew louder, accompanied by a faint rustling, as though the trees themselves were whispering. Then, just ahead of them, they spotted something strange. A small clearing filled with rows of cairnstone piles stacked in a peculiar pattern. The stones were covered in strange symbols, some appearing freshly carved. Aiden ran his fingers over the marks. These symbols, their protective runes, used to ward off spirits. But why would they be here? And who made them? Louis' voice shook. "Maybe to keep something in." At that moment, the air turned icy, and the mist thickened, swirling around them in twisting shapes, almost humanoid forms. Marla gasped, clutching her notebook to her chest, her eyes darting over the fog as one of the shapes moved closer, solidifying into the faint outline of a young face, hollow eyes, a mouth open in a silent scream. Luz backed up, his voice a frantic whisper. "Aiden, we need to leave, now." But Aiden stood transfixed, as though mesmerized by the apparition. This is one of the campers, isn't it? Look at her clothes. That has to be Nana." The ghostly figure of Nana hovered in the mist, her eyes locked on Aiden's, a hand stretching toward him. Her lips moved, and though no sound came, he understood her message clearly. "Help us." Marla pulled Aiden back, her voice desperate. "If these spirits are trapped here, they're part of the curse. We're not helping them by being here. We're just feeding whatever's keeping them trapped." Luz gestured toward the cairns. "Maybe that's what these stones are for. Maybe they're meant to keep the spirits from wandering, or to keep them away from the lake." But Aiden's curiosity was now a driving force, fueled by a growing sense of obligation to the lost campers. "I think we need to go to the lake," he insisted. "Maybe that's the key. The legends all say the lake takes people." Reluctantly, Marla and Luz followed, the weight of the cold mist pressing down on them as they moved toward the water's edge. Lake Mirrow was deathly still, its surface an impenetrable black, reflecting none of the cloudy sky above. As they approached, a low, echoing voice seemed to drift up from the water itself. Aiden strained to listen, catching fragments of words, ghostly echoes of pleas and cries for help. He leaned in closer, hypnotized by the strange resonance, until his foot hit something at the shoreline, something sharp and cold. He knelt, digging slightly, until he pulled a small object from the muddy ground. It was a pendant, covered in silt and moss. Aiden wiped it clean, revealing an engraving on the back. "Brody." Marla gasped, a chill running down her spine. "That's one of the campers' names." The mist thickened further, and suddenly, the faces of the missing teens began appearing in the water. Brody, Tyler, Nen, all their features twisted with terror. They mouthed words, gestures of desperation, as if struggling against something holding them beneath the surface. Luz staggered back. "We need to break whatever's binding them here. But how? The stones didn't work, and if it's the lake itself?" But Aiden's gaze was fixed on the water, determination hardening his face. "It's not just the lake. It's whatever is in it. Something is anchoring them here." As if in response, the lake rippled, and a dark, sinuous shape began to rise from its depths. It was enormous, an inky black mass that defied form, constantly shifting with the mist. Eyes blinked open across its surface, hollow, empty, yet filled with a terrible hunger. The entity seemed to regard them, its focus intensifying until the weight of its gaze became almost physical. Marla screamed as the creature's tendrils shot forward, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward the water. Aiden lunged, grabbing her arm, while Luce fumbled with a small vial of salt he kept for protection, pouring a line of it around them in desperation. The creature recoiled slightly, its mass retreating, but the hollow eyes never left them. "Marla, are you okay?" Aiden asked, pulling her to her feet. Breathless and pale, she nodded. "We have to sever the lake's hold. Maybe if we disrupt the cairns." Luce's eyes widened with realization. Those cairns might be binding markers. If we destroy them, maybe we can release the spirits and stop the creature from pulling us under. They raced back to the clearing, the creature's enraged howls echoing from the lake as they reached the circle of stone piles. Without a moment's hesitation, Aiden kicked the first cairn over, scattering the stones. Marla and Luce joined in, frantically toppling each pile, until each rune lay broken, fragments scattered across the ground. As the final stone hit the earth, a powerful gust of wind tore through the forest, carrying with it the voices of the campers. Cries of pain shifted to sighs of relief, and finally, silence fell as the mist lifted, dispersing into the trees. Back at the lake, they found the water clear, a perfect mirror reflecting the darkening sky. The entity had vanished, and the faces of the campers no longer lingered beneath the surface. They stood in silence, looking out over the calm lake, knowing that whatever curse had gripped Cedar Hollow had finally been broken. And as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Aiden could have sworn he heard a faint whisper, a voice that sounded like Nina's, saying, "Thank you." They left Cedar Hollow that night, vowing never to return, but each of them knew that, somewhere deep within the shadows of Lake Mirrow, something ancient had stirred and, perhaps, was waiting.